In the summer of 1951, a Canadian archaeologist knelt in the red soil of a hilltop on Manitoulin Island, brushed away a layer of gravel that had not been touched since before the last ice age, and lifted out a stone tool that, according to everything science believed at the time, should not have existed. He did not know it yet. But the object resting in the palm of his hand was going to end his career, drain his savings, and quietly vanish from the official story of North America for the next 50 years. His name was Thomas E. Lee. He worked for the National Museum of Canada, and the place he was digging carried the name Shegianda, a windswept ridge on the largest freshwater island on Earth, a place the Ojibwe had walked for far longer than anyone in Ottawa was prepared to admit. This is the story of what came out of that ground. It is a story about stone tools buried beneath glacial clay. It is a story about dates so old they tore a hole straight through the accepted history of humankind. But more than anything, it is a story about money, about who owns the past. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. About who profits from keeping it short, and about what happens to a man who digs up an inconvenient truth on land that somebody else has already claimed, mapped, taxed, and sold. To understand what he found, you first have to understand where he was standing. Manitoulin Island sits in the cold northern waters of Lake Huron, a slab of ancient limestone and quartzite roughly the size of a small nation, stitched together with more than 100 inland lakes. The Anishinaabe, the people the wider world would come to call the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, have known this island across a span of time that makes European history look like a single afternoon. They did not call it a discovery, they called it home. In their language, the island carries the meaning of the spirit's dwelling place, the resting ground of Gitche Manitou. For them, the ground was never empty. It was never waiting to be found. It was already full of memory, and it had been for a very long time. That distinction matters, because the men who arrived with shovels and survey stakes in the middle of the 20th century were not looking for memory. They were looking for a timeline. And the timeline they carried in their heads was a rigid, tidy, deeply convenient thing. The accepted story in 1951 went like this. Human beings crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska somewhere around 11,000 years ago. They filtered south. They spread across two supposedly empty continents. And everything, every arrowhead, every hearth, every buried settlement had to fit inside that narrow window. Anything older was, by definition, impossible. Not unlikely. Impossible. The kind of thing that got a career quietly retired and a file marked closed. Thomas Lee did not set out to break that rule. He was a careful man, methodical, the sort who measured twice and wrote everything down in a steady hand. He came to Shegianda because local people and earlier observers had noticed something strange scattered across the hilltop. Stone. Worked stone. Quartzite that had been struck and shaped and flaked by human hands, sitting out in the open, sometimes half buried in the thin soil, sometimes just lying on the surface as if someone had set it down that very morning and walked away. So he dug. And what he uncovered in those first seasons was already extraordinary, layer after layer of tools. Thousands upon thousands of worked pieces, a whole industry frozen in the earth, a place where people had gathered raw stone and made things from it, generation after generation, until the hill itself was made partly of their labour. He and his team hauled out crate after crate. The catalogue ran into the tens of thousands of artefacts, scrapers, points, cores, the debris of endless tool-making. But then he reached the bottom, and that is where the trouble truly began. Underneath the layers that everyone could agree were ordinary, underneath the material that fit the approved timeline without complaint, Lee found more tools. And these were not sitting in loose topsoil. They were locked inside a layer of hard, compacted clay and gravel, glacial till, the kind of dense, jumbled, unsorted material that gets laid down not by a gentle river or a drifting wind, but by a moving sheet of ice grinding and dragging its way across the land during an ice age. Now sit with what that means. because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. If a human tool is resting inside glacial till, and that till was deposited by the ice as it advanced, then the tool was there before the ice arrived, not dropped in afterward, sealed in beforehand. And the glaciations that shaped that region did not end a neat 11,000 years ago. They reached back tens of thousands of years, advance after advance, cold age after cold age. Some readings of the geology pointed to a picture older still, to a time so remote that the human mind struggles to hold it. Lee did not make this claim alone, and he did not make it recklessly. A geologist named John Sanford examined the deposits in detail and concluded that the artifact-bearing layers were genuinely glacial, that the tools were embedded in material laid down by the ice itself, rather than washed in later. If Sanford was right, then human beings had been shaping stone on Manitoulin Island not 11,000 years ago, but possibly 30,000 years ago. The numbers that began circulating around the site were not the kind that stretched the accepted timeline by a comfortable margin. They were the kind that set fire to it. The counterattack, when it came, fastened onto that single word, glacial. Critics argued that the deposit holding the deepest tools was not true glacial till at all, but a weathered old soil, the sort of thing that might have formed in a warmer gap between ice ages and then been churned, allowing younger tools to work their way down into older-looking ground. If that were so, the impossible dates would simply evaporate, and the whole problem would tidy itself neatly back into the accepted picture. Sanford and Lee held their ground. The layer was ice-laid, they insisted, and the tools inside it were older than the ice. The disagreement should have been settled the way science is supposed to settle things, by returning to the site, sampling it exhaustively, and testing every competing claim out in the open. Instead, the dispute curdled. Reputations hardened into armor, and the site slid quietly out of the light before the question could ever be answered, which is the one outcome that serves no honest inquiry and almost every entrenched interest. Think about the scale of that claim. A single hilltop in Lake Huron was quietly suggesting that people had lived, worked, and thrived across North America during an age when the textbooks insisted the entire continent was a silent, frozen, human-free wilderness, sealed under ice, waiting thousands of years for the first hunters to wander down from the north. They were tools, deliberate, skilled, patterned, repeated, the unmistakable product of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it for a very long time. This is the moment the story stops being about archaeology and becomes something else entirely. It becomes a story about power, and to see why, you have to follow the money that was already moving across that island long before Thomas Lee ever picked up a trowel. For 2 centuries before that dig, the upper Great Lakes had been one of the richest engines of wealth on the continent. The trade in beaver pelts pulled enormous fortunes out of these waters and shipped them across an ocean, building companies, banks, and family dynasties on the far side of the world. The whole system depended on treating the land as a resource to be drained, and the people who lived there as trading partners at best and obstacles at worst. What it could never afford to treat them as was the ancient and rightful owners of a homeland with a history longer than the kingdoms doing the buying. Then came the harder, more permanent kind of taking. In 1850, the Crown sat down with the Anishinaabe leaders of the upper Great Lakes and signed the Robinson-Huron Treaty. On paper, it opened the north shore of Lake Huron, this entire region, to mining, timber, and settlement in exchange for a modest annual payment that was promised to rise as the land produced wealth. Copper came out of that ground. Timber came off it by the shipload. Fish came out of the water by the ton. Parcels were drawn, sold, resold, and mortgaged. An entire property economy was built on top of the island, layer by legal layer, deed by deed. And every single one of those transactions rested on a quiet, unspoken assumption that the land had a beginning that could be documented, that its real history started, more or less, when the newcomers arrived to write it down. The deeper past was treated as a blank. You cannot owe a debt to a blank. You cannot be a guest on a blank. You cannot have your title challenged by people whose presence stretches back into a depth of time your own laws refuse to even recognize as real. There is a phrase for this in the old language of empire, terra nullius, nobody's land. It is the legal fiction that ground can be treated as empty and available for the taking if the people already living upon it are judged, conveniently, to have no history the law is obliged to honour. The entire architecture of colonial property rests on a starting line, a chosen moment when the meaningful clock is declared to begin. Everything before that line gets pushed into a fog, mythologized, shrunk, or flatly denied. And the further back real, provable human occupation can be pushed, the more ridiculous that fiction becomes. 30,000 years of continuous presence does not fit inside terra nullius. It detonates it from within, which is exactly why a hilltop crowded with ancient tools was never going to be welcomed as a harmless scientific curiosity. It was received as what it truly was, a direct challenge to the paperwork that the entire modern map had been printed on top of. Now imagine what happens if that blank suddenly fills in. Imagine a government museum formally announcing that human beings had occupied that exact island for 30,000 years, or 50, or more. That the people whose descendants still lived there, whose oral histories spoke of ancestors reaching back beyond the edge of memory, had been telling a version of the truth the whole time. The story of a recent, thin, easily purchased past does not merely become complicated, it falls apart, and a great deal of money is sitting on top of it when it does. This is precisely what researchers in the revisionist economic history space point to when they look at Cheguianda. They argue that the fight over those stone tools was never really a fight about carbon dates and glacial clay at all. It was a fight about the foundations underneath an entire economy, about who was here first, and for how long, and what that vast length of time might be worth if anyone were ever forced to add it up honestly and pay what the ledger showed. And that ledger, as it happens, was never only a metaphor. The Robinson-Huron Treaty had contained a specific promise that rarely gets mentioned. The yearly payment owed to the Anishinaabe was meant to rise as the wealth drawn from their land increased. That escalation was written into the document itself, in plain terms. Yet for well over a century the payment sat frozen at a few dollars per person and was never raised, no matter how much copper, timber and fortune came pouring out of the region and into other hands. The descendants of the people who had signed spent generation after generation pressing to have that broken promise honoured, fighting to force the ledger open and make the arithmetic honest at last. It took until our own era for the courts to finally agree that the debt was real and had gone unpaid for lifetimes. So when Thomas Lee's tools threatened to make the human story on that island vastly older than anyone in authority had ever admitted, they were not landing in neutral ground. They were landing squarely on top of an open financial wound, in a place where the true and unpaid cost of the land was already a live and dangerous question. And here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Thomas Lee's findings were not calmly debated in good faith and then gently set aside. According to his own account, and the accounts of the few who stood by him, they were buried. Not the artifacts this time. The man, Lee later wrote, with a bitterness that never left him, about what had happened. He described a sustained effort to discredit the site and everyone associated with it. He said the bulk of the excavated material was scattered and made deliberately difficult to study, as though the evidence itself were being quietly dismantled. He said the site was very nearly turned into a tourist attraction, a move that would have destroyed its scientific value forever, effectively paving over the proof with a parking lot and a gift shop. He claimed that the museum director who had supported his work was forced out of his position, and he claimed that he himself was frozen out of his own profession, unable to find work in the field he had given his life to, punished, as he saw it, for the single crime of publishing what his own excavation had plainly shown him. Whether every detail of that account is exactly right, historians still argue to this day. The mainstream position for decades was that the deposits had simply been misread, that natural processes could have churned older soil together with younger tools, that the extraordinary dates were never truly proven and so could be safely set aside. That reply belongs on the table, and honesty demands we keep it there. But even the skeptics have to reckon with one deeply uncomfortable fact. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A serious site, excavated by a trained professional, producing tens of thousands of artifacts, was allowed to fade almost completely out of the scientific conversation. A scientist who reported something the establishment did not want to hear watched his career dissolve around him, and the questions he raised were never really answered. They were starved of oxygen year after year, until nearly everyone simply forgot to keep asking them. For the people who study these patterns, Shegianda is not an isolated accident or a one-off tragedy. It is a single data point in something far larger. And this is where the story opens out into the wider territory this field has been quietly mapping for years. The pattern tends to go like this. Again and again, across every continent, a discovery surfaces that refuses to fit the approved timeline, an impossibly old tool, a structure that seems too advanced for the age assigned to it. A layer in the earth that appears to record a sudden and violent disruption, a vast flood of mud and water that swallowed a previous world and reset the count of history to something close to zero. And again, that discovery is not examined with open curiosity and celebrated. It is minimized, mislabeled, quietly reclassified into something harmless, or simply left to gather dust in a storage drawer while the official history rolls onward, smooth and undisturbed. To see how Shegianda fits the larger picture, you have to understand the idea of the reset. In the revisionist telling, history is not one long continuous line at all. It is a series of chapters divided by catastrophe, by floods of mud and water that drowned the older world and left the scattered survivors to rebuild on top of the ruins, often with almost no memory of what had come before. Look closely enough, the argument runs, and you can find the seam. A civilization that appears to begin already fully formed, as though it inherited tools and knowledge it never actually invented. And Shegianda is far from the only North American site to trouble the timeline in this way. Across the continent, from contested desert workshops in the southwest to ancient bone beds in the far north, other researchers have drawn evidence out of the earth that seemed to push human presence back tens of thousands of years, only to watch that evidence attacked, defunded, ridiculed, or quietly shelved. Each case, taken entirely on its own, is easy enough to wave away. But line them up side by side, and a shape begins to emerge that is far harder to explain as nothing more than a long run of honest mistakes. The name that has attached itself to this hidden older world is Tartaria. In the revisionist framing, Tartaria is far more than a forgotten empire on a faded old map. A civilization, or a connected network of them, older and more accomplished than we have been permitted to believe, whose works were absorbed, rebranded, reassigned, or erased by the powers that rose in their place. In this telling, history was not simply recorded and passed down. It was edited, and the editing was not idle. It had a purpose. Because whoever controls the story of the past also controls the deeds, the debts, and the claims that stand upon it in the present. Manitoulin fits that framework almost too well to ignore. An island whose very name speaks of spirit and deep, ancient power. A ground that gave up tools older than the official story could ever allow. A discovery suppressed at the precise moment its truth would have threatened a young, aggressive, resource-hungry economy. And beneath all of it, a people who never once needed a museum to tell them their history ran deep, because they had carried that history in their own words, unbroken, across an unfathomable number of generations. That last piece is the one the institutions were least equipped to understand, and it may be the most important part of the entire story. Long before Thomas Lee ever arrived with his crates and his careful notes, the Anishinaabe held their own account of time, and it was not a small one. Their oral traditions do not measure the past in the thin centuries of a land deed. They speak of great migrations that unfolded over immense stretches of time, of a journey guided by prophecy from the eastern sea to the place in the west where the food grows upon the water. They speak of a sacred shell that rose to lead the people, of teachers, and of stopping places along a road that took countless lifetimes to walk. They speak of ancestors, and of worlds that came before this one. In their understanding, this island was inhabited, sacred, and known across a depth of time that Western science was only beginning to stumble toward, blinking and disbelieving in 1951 with a shovel in one hand and an impossible stone tool in the other. There is a teaching carried among the Anishinaabe known as the prophecy of the seven fires. It speaks of the ages the people would move through, a time of great migration, a time of terrible loss, when much of the old knowledge would be scattered and very nearly forgotten. And then a later time, when a new generation would turn around, retrace its steps along the road, gather up what had been dropped and abandoned in the dust, and rekindle the fire that had almost gone out entirely. Read that prophecy against the story of this island, and the resonance is difficult to shake off. Here was ancient knowledge of a deep past, driven underground, dismissed, and very nearly lost for good. And here, decades on, are people returning to the ridge, to the archives, to the elders, patiently gathering up the scattered pieces and asking the old questions all over again. That prophecy never needed a museum to confirm it. If anything, it had been quietly describing the museum's behavior the entire time. So, when researchers in this field set the two accounts side by side, the tidy 11,000 years of the textbook against the vast, layered, living memory of the people who actually lived there, they noticed something that should stop us cold. The stone tools locked in the glacial till do not contradict the Anishinaabe. They confirm them. It was the official timeline, the short and convenient one, that turned out to be the fragile and unreliable story. The Ojibwe were never waiting to be told how old their home was. They were the ones who had remembered all along, while the institutions worked very hard, and at times very deliberately, to forget. And notice what kind of forgetting this actually was. Not the soft, natural fading of things simply too old to recall. This was active. It took real effort. A culture that genuinely trusted its own timeline would have had nothing to fear from an old hill. It would have swarmed that site with curiosity and funding, desperate to understand something so strange and so important. The response Shegianda actually received, the shrug, the reclassification, the slow professional freeze, is not the response of confidence. It is the response of a story that knows, somewhere deep in its foundations, that it cannot afford to be tested too hard. Forgetting, when it is done this deliberately, is simply another word for hiding. And that single realization reframes the entire episode. The men who came to survey, to date, and to classify were not carrying knowledge into an empty place. They were arriving at a place already thick with knowledge, deep and old and carefully kept. And their first instinct, the moment that knowledge proved too large, too ancient, and too costly to accept, was to bury it a second time. Which brings us to the question that hangs over this whole story like a shadow. Why? Why would anyone go to such lengths to keep the past small? Follow the incentives, and it begins to make a grim and simple kind of sense. A short past is a cheap past. If the human story on that land began only recently, then the treaties look generous, the purchases look fair, the extraction of copper and timber and fish looks clean, and the wealth flows to its new owners with an untroubled conscience. But a deep past changes the arithmetic entirely. A deep past implies a deep relationship, a deep claim, and quite possibly a deep and unpaid debt. It suggests that the people who accepted a modest annual sum for their homeland were the living inheritors of something far older and far greater than the men across the treaty table ever admitted they were buying. Acknowledge that, and you do not merely rewrite a chapter in a school book, you reopen the ledger itself. And there have always been powerful people who would much rather that particular ledger stayed firmly closed. This is the real question at the heart of revisionist economic history. Not simply, what happened, but rather, who benefits from the version of what happened that we were handed? When you look at Shegianda through that single lens, the suppression stops resembling a dry scientific disagreement and starts to look like an act of accounting. A decision, whether fully conscious or half instinctive, to protect a story because far too much money was already standing on top of it to let it fall. None of this means every wild claim ever made about the site is true, and honesty requires saying so plainly. The truthful position is that we still do not know the full age of what Thomas Lee pulled from that hill, because the process that should have settled the matter was interrupted and never allowed to finish. And that is exactly the point. The evidence was not disproven in a fair and open fight. It was removed from the ring before the bell could ring, and a question that never receives an honest hearing does not simply disappear. It waits, in a storage drawer, in the undisturbed ground, in the unbroken memory of the people who were always there, until someone finally finds the nerve to ask it again out loud. Decades later, researchers did return to Shegyanda with fresh eyes and sharper methods. They confirmed that people had used that site across an extraordinarily long span of time, deeper than the comfortable early estimates had wanted to allow, a place occupied and reoccupied as the land, the water, and even the ice itself changed shape around it. The most extreme of the original claims remain contested, and perhaps they always will, but the ridge gave up more than enough to make one thing undeniable. The hilltop was old, far older than the tidy story that had nearly erased it. And the man who first stood up and said so was not a crank or a fool, he was simply early. Thomas Lee died without the vindication he was owed. He spent his final years convinced that he had witnessed something rare and genuinely ugly, the machinery of official history closing ranks against a fact it could not afford to hold in the light. He may well have gotten some of the details wrong along the way, but he understood the shape of the thing perfectly. He understood that a discovery is never merely a discovery. It is a threat to everyone who has already built their house, and their fortune, on the empty lot next door. In his final years he was, by most accounts, a difficult and haunted man, someone who could not let the matter rest because he never once believed the matter had been honestly settled. He kept the notes, he kept the maps, he kept insisting, to anyone who would still sit and listen, that the answer was in the ground and that the ground had been deliberately looked away from. It is easy to paint a man like that as simply bitter and leave it there. It is harder, and almost certainly more accurate, to admit that bitterness is very often what integrity ends up looking like after the institutions have finished with it. So consider, one final time, that single stone tool, struck from quartzite by a human hand, on a spirit island set in a freshwater sea, at a time so remote that our neat maps of the past leave no room for it at all. It sat in the earth through an entire ice age. It waited out the arrival of the fur traders, the treaties, the surveyors, the mines, and the museums. It surfaced for one brief summer into the hands of a man who understood exactly what it meant, and then it was pushed back down into silence and very nearly lost for good. But silence has never been the same thing as erasure. The tool existed. The ground remembers. The Anishinaabe remember. And every so often, on that windswept ridge above the cold water of Lake Huron, the past pushes up through the gravel again, patient and stubborn and finally undeniable, to remind us of a simple and genuinely dangerous truth. The story we were sold is not the whole story. It was never meant to be. And the real history of that island, deep and long and only now beginning to be heard, was lying under the Ojibwe ground the entire time, waiting for anyone brave enough or honest enough to lift it back into the light.